It is the Odd Couple, Rob and Kelvin on the Magic City Monday, and we're coming to you live from the TireRack.com studios, and we're joined right now by MLB Super Sports agent Scott Boras. You can Boras Core on Twitter. Scott, it is great to have you on. How you doing?
What's up, Scott?
Hey, Rob. How you guys doing? Good afternoon.
Yes.
Doing great. Appreciate you taking some time out.
100%. Definitely. You know, I wanted to talk to you, and let's start with, of course, Juan Soto and his deal with the New York Metropolitan, $765 million. I just got two things, Scott. First, when he turned down the $440 in Washington, I thought he was absolutely crazy that someone gets offered $500 million, fully guaranteed, not a fake NFL contract, not a funny two-way NBA contract, right. But you know, all the way, he bet on himself. How shocked or surprised that once Shohei signed for $700, I never thought anybody would be higher than that he got more than Shohei.
Well, going into this, the element of, you have to give Juan a lot of credit because we had, I believe, since he was 18 years old on, we've had 68 meetings, and certainly after we finished with the Mets, Juan looked at me and goes, "Can we just tone that down a little bit?" And kind of, but it's a lot of information, a lot of preliminary market data, a lot of historical data. We have a thing in baseball called surplus value, which is a value gradient that we use, and we developed one that I did based upon my representation of Bonds and A-Rod and their skill sets and what they did and why, so that we could really get to him and say, these are the valuative points we look at. And when a player goes through that, particularly an international player, you can imagine the number of people, which is the vast, vast majority, that say to Juan, how could you turn down $440 million? And the answer is he's getting all this information from us about prospective values, markets, franchise values, revenues of the sport, and really what his valuation is going to be as he goes on in his career in year 4, 5, and 6 before he's a free agent. And then when Ohtani signed, and his real evaluation is at a $460 million valuation. That's what the contract, because there's a lot of, makes $2 million a year for 10 years and then gets paid much later.
Right.
So the real valuation was around that. So everyone came to Juan and said, "You don't pitch. Ohtani's an extraordinary player. In addition to that, he generates, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for his team. You don't do that. So your chances of getting the 450 or 460 that Ohtani got are, it's just not something you're going to be able to achieve. Will you get as much as you got from Washington?" He had to hear that for almost a full year, in and of itself. And, it's I give him a lot of credit. He trusted our information, our advice, and ask a lot of questions. Well, why didn't Ohtani get what he was worth, or all these things, which are all the elements of how we look at markets and evaluations. And essentially, he trusted our data and the information, and as it worked out, to his credit, he was able to focus on playing and played at a very high level. And then we had a very strategic negotiation to arrive at really a true expression of his market.
Now, Scott, I'll say this. He's a great player. He could play anywhere. That transfers to anywhere when you're great and you're a dynamic player. But it looked like the Bronx was perfect. The Dominicans loved him there, like the right field porch. He had a career high in home runs. The Yankees made it to the World Series. There was a lot to like there, the lineup and whatnot. And I get it. The Yankees offered $760. The Mets offered $765. And the Mets offered, the Yankees had offered, an extra year, Scott, right? So it's a different amount of money spread out over the years, right? The Yankees added one more year than the Mets did. But how difficult is that when you take a player who has excelled and seem to fit in a circumstance or a team. Because you know this, the Mets and Yankees aren't the same, even though they're in the same city. Mm-hmm. They're not. What goes into that, Scott?
Well, my job is to provide information. In the end, you know, providing one with the economic appraisal of not only those two teams, but, you know, many others. And in each case, one had to dismiss teams. I teased him because he had uncles and his mother and everyone involved. I called it the Supreme Court of Soto. And I would give him the information. He would go back. And what I cared about was the baseball execution information. And he had a near 1,100 OPS at Citi Field. He played well at Yankee Stadium. We wanted to cover the fact of execution and doing it at optimal places. And he had choices there. And as far as what works best for him and his family, the ability of an owner to support a winning roster was very important to Juan because he wanted to win during the 15 years of his contract. So all those things were considered by him. But in the end, Rob, when you go to make these decisions, the key point, what you do, I think, in being a former player, you understand how you play and what makes you comfortable. I trust that Juan knows that, and he certainly expressed it. And also being around his family and giving us direction, I wanted them to make that decision. And he certainly looked at all that information. We spent a lot of time covering it and called me on the phone and said, look, go ahead and work the final with the Mets. And we all think as a family that it's best for us to do so. So I certainly trusted in that. He was very informed and has been very methodical about his decision-making. And so we went and executed the contract to get down with the Mets.
He is Scott Boras, MLB sports agent, and really one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in all of sports. Scott joining the Odd Couple, Rob and Kelvin. Scott, let me ask you this. You mentioned it earlier, the deferment money. That's something that Shohei Ohtani's done. A lot of people
Dodgers
are confused by that.
leading the league with deferment.
The Dodgers are saying, hey, we'll give you 2-3 a year. On the back end, there's your 68, 70 million. We've heard recently where the commissioner started to kind of toss around the idea of some type of salary cap because people are saying this isn't fair. Other teams, including the Yankees, saying this isn't fair of all the teams, Scott. But what are your thoughts on deferment? You think it's okay? You think it's fine? Is it level in the playing field, or is it not fair and it will eventually lead to a salary cap?
Well, I think the point of it is that how are salary caps working? Well, in the NFL, we had a lockout in 2011. In the NBA, they had a lockout. In the NHL, they had one. And they're all cap elements. How's it working in competition? Well, the NFL even riggers their schedule, and they still have 2 of the last 3 years the same Super Bowl team.
Yep.
You have 4 or 5, one team in the Super Bowl 4 to 5 times. Because if anything, salary caps are supposed to promote parity. Well, they're not working. So the only thing salary caps really do is provide ownership with a greater economic purpose than they would otherwise. So when you're talking about deferrals are a method of what is the appraisal of the player's value. You know, and I realize that they give some funny money, as we call it, later in the future, but Ohtani's contract is worth $450 million. It said the league says it, the players' union says that, because of the fact that there's a net present value that you would use about how you appraise it. And so deferral is something that is merely a mechanism that helps flexibility or whatever, because every team in baseball uses it. Every team has the opportunity to use it. There is no unfairness about it. And the point of it is, like when I did Blake Snell's contract with Andrew and the Dodgers, you know, we got at the time a record signing bonus until we did once, but of like $50-something million, and they also deferred an equivalent amount for future years, and that made the net present value of the contract for our purposes to be fair for the player, because that, in the end, is the valuation. It is what is that player's work. And when you look at the Dodgers, their contracts for Hernandez or Kike or for really anyone they signed they're not above market contracts. They're not paying valuations for players that are in any way any different than what any other team is paying. So, because they did, if you had a situation where one team was paying dramatically more for players than others, you would say, well, then they have this decisive advantage. But keep in mind that our game has gone up in revenues every year. Record revenues last year, record revenues this year.
Last year was $12.1 billion for baseball.
Yes, and the issue is that we have a situation where ownership is saying, but what are we doing with salaries? Well, this year, in 25, the salary amount of money spent on players is going to be the same as 24. It didn't go up by 10% like the revenues. And so the idea of it is we've had 15 teams that lowered their payroll from the prior year, even though they had record revenues. We have 6 teams that aren't even spending $100 million, even though they have record revenues. So when you look at all this and you're saying that there is some sort of element in the game, the truth of the matter is that the NBA TV contract just illustrated something, is that the people that controlled streaming, which was the end of cable because of the handhelds,
right,
was Major League Baseball developed that. MLB BAM developed it. Instead of licensing it, they sold it. And in doing so, they kept dealing and have long-term contracts with cable companies, knowing that the form of doing business with them was changing. And that preempted them from a market that they should have had access to years before. The NBA, on the other hand, who, to give you an example, in Milwaukee, have lower ratings than the Brewers, the Bucks do. The Bucks play only half the games of the Brewers, yet the media contract in Milwaukee, the amount of revenues that the Brewers make is only half of what the Buck gets. And the revenues in the NBA are nearly double over MLB, which tells me that the issue with revenues, it isn't about a salary cap or labor cost. It is about how we're negotiating for media rights. We need to have effective negotiations to where it's obvious if we have double the content that and we should have a greater media rights valuation than the NBA, which would bring a lot more value, both in franchise value and revenues to the owners. So that is how we correct. It's a revenue problem. It is not a salary cap or labor cost problem.
Hey, Scott, last thing. We got a minute to go here. Pete Alonso going back to the Mets. I thought he got jobbed. A 2-year contract for just $54 million. Very few players. The guy plays every day. He knows how to play in New York under the pressure. Hit some of the biggest home runs in the postseason. And they had $765 million for Juan Soto, but only $54 million for one of their own. How tough was that for him to go back to the Mets and for that contract?
Well, the truth of it is that when you are a 30-year-old player in our game and you have a qualifying offer, meaning that you have to give up draft picks and international money, major league teams do not want to do that. They'll do it for a 26-year-old or a 27-year-old or other, but they won't do it for a 30-year-old. And I've had issues with Snell, with Matt Chapman, and now Pete Alonso, with Bregman. They don't want to do the long-term contracts for those. But the next year when they're free agents, then they get their true free agent value in the market because they are truly free. There's no draft picks given up. And the clubs will then go out and pay their value. So the system is working to where they have a restricted free agency, which Pete was under because of the qualifying offer. And you also see people talking, why are these players signed so late? Because teams go after players that are true free agents where they don't have to give away the draft picks, and they approach last in the market the teams where they have to give away the draft picks to sign the players. So the Mets, obviously, because he was his team of origin, didn't have to give up draft picks, and all the other teams involved did not bid for Pete because, after all, they all say, why would I ever give up draft picks when the reward of that is getting anywhere from 34 to 50 home runs and having a player with 1,000 OPS who hits key home runs in the postseason.
Yep.
I won't do that till next year. That's kind of what they said.
Hey,
right.
Scott, man, it's been a
Scott,
pleasure.
thank
Learned
you,
so
Scott.
much. Scott Boras, the great agent. Thank you so much. We appreciate
Scott.
you.
Thank you.